The first thing Harper felt wasn't the pain, but the sound. A sharp, crystalline crack that seemed to silence the entire world, followed by a concussive force that drove the air from her lungs. She was falling, but the impact against her back came first, a spiderweb of fire and ice spreading across her shoulders. The low hum of the exclusive dining room, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of powerful men making deals. It all vanished, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Shards of glass, sharp as razors, rained down around her as she hit the polished mahogany floor. For a frozen second, no one moved. Then, a shadow fell over her. She looked up, her vision swimming into a pair of eyes the color of a winter storm. They weren't panicked or surprised. They were analytical, cold, and utterly in control. This was the man she had thrown herself in front of, the man the flying whiskey tumbler had been meant for. He was older, perhaps 50, with a face carved from granite and a stillness that seemed to bend the chaos around him. He was Commander Elias Thorne, retired Navy SEAL, and Harper Ilara, a waitress drowning in student debt, had just taken a hit meant to kill him. The silence broke. A woman screamed. A chair scraped back violently, but Thorne didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked on her, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths, not gratitude, but calculation. In that moment, Harper knew her life had just shattered as completely as the glass embedded in her back. Just 2 hours earlier, her world had been small and predictable, defined by the ache in her feet and the weight of her order pad. The Gilded Anchor was one of those steakhouse institutions in the city's financial district, a place where fortunes were made and secrets were traded over $100 ribeyes. The air smelled of seared meat, old leather, and an entitlement so thick you could taste it. Harper had learned the art of being invisible here. She refilled water glasses without being asked, cleared plates without a sound, and kept her eyes down. Invisibility was survival. Her life was a tightrope walk over a canyon of debt. A fine arts degree had left her with a portfolio of beautiful, unsellable paintings and a mountain of loans that grew larger every month. The Gilded Anchor paid the rent on her tiny apartment and kept the lights on, but just barely. She moved through the opulent room like a ghost, her mind a constant ledger of table numbers, cooking temperatures, and wine pairings. But her artist's eye never truly shut off. She noticed things. The slight tremor in a CEO's hand as he signed a check, the way a politician's wife smiled at everyone but her husband. The subtle tells, the cracks in the polished facades of the city's elite. It was a habit, a way of seeing the world that had once been for her art, but was now just a silent, useless observation. Then, Commander Thorne had arrived. The room didn't fall silent, but the energy shifted, the frequency changing as if a massive generator had just been switched on somewhere deep underground. He wasn't loud or ostentatious. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored grey suit, no tie. He moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnerving, his head on a constant, subtle swivel. He was seated at table 12, a corner booth with a clear view of the entire room and both exits. 2 other men, equally quiet and watchful, sat with him. They didn't look like businessmen. They looked like soldiers in expensive clothing. Harper was assigned their section. Her heart gave a nervous flutter. This was a table where a mistake wouldn't just cost her a tip. It felt like it could cost her more. She approached with practiced calm. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you with something to drink?" Thorne's stormy eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. It was like looking at a weapon. "Macallan 18. "Neat," he said, his voice a low baritone that vibrated with authority. He didn't look at the menu. He didn't need to. He was a man who knew exactly what he wanted. As she turned to leave, her gaze swept the room out of habit. And that's when she saw him. A man at the bar, nursing a drink he wasn't drinking. He was younger, with a nervous energy that didn't fit the restaurant's calm, predatory atmosphere. His eyes kept flicking toward table 12. A jilted business partner? A scorned employee? Harper filed the detail away. Trouble, her instincts whispered, always sent a scout. 15 minutes later, the feeling intensified. As she delivered the drinks to Thorne's table, she noticed another man, sitting alone by the window. He was older, well-dressed, pretending to read a newspaper. But his paper was held just low enough that his eyes could track the reflection of Thorne's table in the polished glass of the window. He wasn't watching Thorne. He was watching the nervous man at the bar. A spotter. The realization hit her with a jolt of cold fear. This wasn't a random disgruntled associate. This was planned. Her blood ran cold. She wanted to say something, to warn someone. But who? The manager? The police? What would she say? That she had a bad feeling about two men who were just sitting there. They would think she was crazy. She was just a waitress. Her job was to be invisible. She tried to push it away, to focus on her other tables, but her eyes kept being drawn back to the deadly triangle. Thorne, the man at the bar, and the spotter by the window. She saw the spotter give a nearly imperceptible nod. The man at the bar straightened up. He put his drink down and picked up the heavy, empty crystal tumbler beside it. His knuckles were white. His jaw was a hard line of tension. Time seemed to slow down, stretching like warm taffy. Harper was standing 10 feet away, holding a tray with a bottle of water and 2 glasses. She saw the man's arm tense, the muscles in his shoulder bunching. She saw the trajectory in her mind's eye, a perfect, deadly arc aimed directly at the back of Commander Thorne's head. He was talking to one of his men, his attention focused inward. He wouldn't see it coming. Harper didn't think. She didn't weigh the options or consider the consequences. A primal instinct took over, the same instinct that makes a mother shield her child. She dropped her tray. The sound of it clattering to the floor was lost in the sudden spike of adrenaline in her ears. She took 2 fast, lunging steps and threw her body sideways, a desperate, clumsy shield of flesh and bone. The world exploded in sound and pain. The lockdown was brutally efficient. Before the first real scream had died down, Thorne's men were moving. "Doors, comms, eyes up!" one of them barked. The heavy oak doors of the Gilded Anchor slammed shut, the deadbolt sounding like a cannon shot in the stunned silence. Guests were ordered to put their phones on their tables, face down. The man who had thrown the glass was already on the floor, his face pressed into the expensive carpet, an arm twisted behind his back at an impossible angle. But Harper's fading consciousness was fixed on something else. The spotter. The man by the window. In the first seconds of chaos, while all eyes were on the attacker and her crumpled form on the floor, he had simply folded his newspaper, placed a few bills on his table, and walked calmly out a side service exit. No one had noticed. No one but her. Thorne knelt beside her. The scent of expensive whiskey and something metallic, like gun oil, filled her senses. "Medic is 2 minutes out," he said, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't comforting. It was a statement of fact. He gently probed the edge of the wound on her back, his touch surprisingly steady. A fresh wave of agony made her gasp. "The window!" She forced the words out, her throat raw. "The man. By the window. He's gone." Thorne's eyes sharpened, the storm within them intensifying. He looked at one of his men, a man with a jagged scar bisecting his eyebrow. "Kyle, check the service exit. Now." Kyle nodded and vanished. Thorne looked back at Harper. The calculation in his eyes was still there. but it was joined by something else, a flicker of respect. "You saw him?" "He was watching the other one," she whispered, the world starting to go dark at the edges. "He gave a signal." "Stay with me," Thorne commanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the fog in her head. "What did he look like?" "40s. Grey suit. Dark hair," she managed. "He had a ring. Gold. A bird on it. An eagle, maybe." The medic arrived, a compact man with a bag full of military-grade supplies. As he began to work, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of her uniform, Harper felt herself being lifted. Not onto a gurney, but into the arms of one of Thorne's men. The restaurant was being cleared by city police now, but she wasn't being handed over to them. She was being taken out the back, spirited away into an unmarked black sedan that idled in the alley. The last thing she saw before the doors closed was Commander Thorne, standing under the harsh glare of the alley light, speaking into a satellite phone. His face was a mask of cold fury. She hadn't just saved his life. She had seen the ghost, the real architect of the attack, and in doing so, she had transformed from a hero into the one thing more dangerous than an enemy, a loose end. She woke up in a room that was clinically clean and devoid of personality. The walls were a soft, sterile grey. The only window was reinforced with a fine, nearly invisible mesh. Her back was a landscape of fire, each breath a fresh torment, but the wounds had been professionally cleaned and stitched. A silent IV drip fed fluid into her arm. It wasn't a hospital room. It was a holding cell, albeit a luxurious one. A woman in simple grey scrubs entered, her face impassive. "The commander will be in shortly. Do you need anything?" "My phone? I need to call my landlord." "My job?" Harper's voice was hoarse. The woman's expression didn't change. "That won't be possible." The gilded cage. Harper lay back against the pillows, the reality of her situation settling in like a shroud. She was a prisoner, a protected asset, a complication. An hour later, Thorne entered. He had changed out of his suit into a simple black sweater and dark trousers. He looked less like a target and more like a predator in his natural habitat. He pulled up a chair, not too close, and studied her. "The man you saw," he began, "was Julian Croft, ex-Delta. Now he sells his skills to the highest bidder. The man who threw the glass was a hired distraction, a low-level thug meant to be caught. Croft was the real threat. He was there to confirm the hit." "Why?" Harper asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thorne was silent for a long moment. 2 years ago, my team and I were contracted to extract a high-value asset from a failed state in Eastern Europe. The mission went sideways. It was a setup. I was the only one who made it out. I also made it out with this. He tapped a subtle bulge under his sweater. A ledger. Encrypted. It contains names, bank accounts, supply routes. The kind of information powerful people would kill to protect. Croft was on the other side of that deal. He wants the ledger, and he wants me dead. The scale of it was dizzying. This wasn't a business dispute. It was international espionage, played out in a Manhattan steakhouse. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now, you're a problem," Thorne said, his honesty as brutal as a punch. "Croft saw you. He saw you see him. He doesn't know what you told me, but he can't afford to take the chance. To him, you're not a waitress anymore. You're a witness." He leaned forward slightly. "Which means you're a target. As long as you're alive, you're a threat to him." The words hung in the sterile air. Harper felt a cold dread that was worse than the pain in her back. "You can't just... Let me go." A humorless smile touched Thorne's lips. "Letting you go would be a death sentence. Croft would find you before you made it back to your apartment." He stood up. "You'll stay here. You'll be protected. When this is over, we'll create a new identity for you. New life. Somewhere far away. It's the only way." Over the next few days, Harper healed. The physical pain began to recede, replaced by a gnawing anxiety and the suffocating boredom of her confinement. The safe house was a penthouse apartment overlooking the river, staffed by Thorne's men. They were polite, professional, and utterly impenetrable. They brought her food, changed her bandages, and answered her questions with non-answers. She was a package to be guarded. Thorne visited daily. He was a puzzle she couldn't solve. He was cold and remote, yet he ensured she had the best medical care. He spoke of her future disappearance with a chilling pragmatism, yet his eyes held that same flicker of respect she'd seen in the restaurant. He was using her, protecting her, and caging her all at once. Her artist's eye, however, couldn't be caged. She started observing the routines of the guards. Kyle, the scarred second-in-command, was meticulous, his movements precise. A younger guard named Reyes was jumpy, constantly checking his phone. A third, older man named Benning was quiet, almost invisible himself. She learned their shift changes, the cadence of their footsteps, the way they held their weapons. One evening, she noticed something odd. Reyes was on his phone, his back to the room. He was speaking in rapid, hushed Spanish. Harper had taken 2 years of Spanish in college, enough to pick out a few words. La mujer. Sí, todavía aquí. No, el comandante no sospecha nada. The woman, yes, still here. No, the commander doesn't suspect anything. A cold knot formed in her stomach. Was he talking about her? Reporting her status to someone? It could be an innocent call to his family. But the furtive way he spoke, the mention of the commander. It felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal. She knew she couldn't go to Thorne with a half-heard, poorly translated phone call. He dealt in facts, in certainties. An accusation based on a feeling would get her dismissed as a paranoid civilian. She needed proof. She needed to stop being a victim and start being a player. For the next 2 days, she watched Reyes like a hawk. She noted his habits. He was careless with his personal items. He often left his duffel bag unzipped in the small gym area of the penthouse when he worked out. He was obsessed with a specific brand of energy drink, always leaving the empty cans on the counter. Her opportunity came during a shift change. Reyes was showering after a workout, and Benning was just coming on duty, distracted by a call from Thorne. Harper slipped into the gym, her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands were slick with sweat. She felt like a trespasser in a world where a mistake could get her killed. She went straight to Reyes's duffel bag. Rummaging through it felt like a profound violation. But fear was a powerful motivator. Tucked into a side pocket, beneath a pair of workout gloves, her fingers closed around a small, hard rectangle. A burner phone. She ducked into the adjoining bathroom, her hands trembling as she powered it on. There was only one number in the contacts, labeled J. The message history was short, but damning. J. Status? Asset secure. Commander visits daily. J. Any change? None. She's healing. He trusts me. J. Good. Wait for the signal. He won't see it coming. The last message had been sent just an hour ago. It was all there. Reyes was the mole. He was reporting directly to Julian Croft. The relief was so intense, it almost made her dizzy. She had proof. Hard, undeniable proof. She could finally show Thorne she was more than just a liability. She was an asset. She snapped a few pictures of the screen with her own phone. A small victory, as Kyle had returned it to her 2 days ago, stating the immediate threat was contained. She slipped the burner phone back into the duffel bag, exactly where she'd found it, and walked out of the gym, her face a mask of calm. She waited until Cale was alone in the main living area, reviewing security schematics on a tablet. He was Thorne's most trusted man, the one who had followed his orders without question in the restaurant. Going to him seemed like the most logical, secure step. "Kyle," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to show you something. It's urgent." He looked up from his tablet, his scarred eyebrow raised in question. "What is it?" "It's Reyes," she said, pulling out her phone and showing him the pictures of the burner phone's messages. "He's the mole. He's been talking to Croft." Kyle's eyes narrowed as he studied the images. He swiped through them, his expression hardening with each one. He looked from her phone to her face, a grim understanding dawning in his eyes. He stood up, his hand reflexively going to the weapon on his hip. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Don't move." He strode toward the gym where Reyes was just emerging, dressed in fresh clothes. At the same moment, the elevator dinged, and Commander Thorne stepped into the penthouse, his face set in its usual hard lines. "What's going on?" Thorne asked, his gaze taking in the scene, Cale's aggressive posture, Harper's tense expression. Kyle didn't look at him. He kept his eyes locked on Reyes, who had frozen, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. "We have a problem," Kyle said. "We have a mole." "I know," Thorne said, quietly. Harper felt a surge of validation. He knew. He must have suspected it too. Kyle finally turned to face his commander. "It's worse than we thought." He held up Harper's phone, displaying the incriminating pictures. "She's been reporting to Croft since she got here." The world tilted on its axis. Harper stared at him, the words not making sense. "What? No! It's Reyes! The phone was in his bag." Thorne walked over and took the phone from Kyle. He looked at the pictures, then at Harper. The flicker of respect in his eyes was gone, replaced by a gaze as cold and unforgiving as a glacier. "My phone," Reyes said, his voice laced with manufactured panic as he stepped forward. "She must have taken it. I was looking for it everywhere." "That's a lie." Harper's voice was sharp with disbelief. "That's a burner phone. The messages prove he's the traitor." Kyle shook his head, a look of grim disappointment on his face. "We found another phone, Ma'am, in your room, tucked under the mattress." He held up a clear evidence bag containing an identical burner phone. "This one has only one outgoing message, sent 30 minutes ago to an untraceable number." He turned the bag so she could see the screen. The message was simple. "It's done. They trust me. Thorne is here. Now." It was a trap, a perfect, inescapable trap. They had planted the phone on her. The evidence she had found, the proof she had been so proud of, had been bait. She had walked right into it, leading them straight to the conclusion they wanted. She was the mole. Thorne looked at her, his face an unreadable mask of stone. The man she had saved, the man who had promised to protect her, now saw her as the ultimate threat. The enemy wasn't just outside the walls anymore. According to the evidence, the enemy was her, and she was trapped in a cage with the very men she had just tried to warn. The silence in the penthouse was a new kind of prison. After the accusation, Harper was escorted to her room, the lock clicking shut with a finality that echoed the closing of a tomb. The polite professional guards were gone, replaced by the cold, watchful eyes of Cale and Benning. They saw a traitor. Reyes, the real snake, moved about the apartment with a newfound confidence, a subtle smirk playing on his lips whenever he caught her gaze. He was the trusted soldier. She was the enemy within. Thorne was a ghost. He didn't visit. He didn't question her. Through the crack under her door, she heard his low voice on the phone, discussing contingencies, exit strategies, and the disposal of the compromised asset. Her. He was methodically planning her erasure. The man she had saved was now deciding how best to bury his mistake. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making each breath a conscious effort. They had taken her phone again. She was utterly alone, armed with nothing but a truth no one would believe. She had to stop thinking like a waitress. A waitress asks for help, follows orders, waits for someone else to solve the problem. That person was dead. She had to think like an artist. An artist observes, deconstructs, finds the hidden patterns beneath the surface. Her life depended on seeing what they couldn't. On the third day of her solitary confinement, she begged Cale for her sketchbook and a pencil. "I'm going crazy in here," she pleaded, letting her voice crack with desperation she didn't have to fake. "I just need to draw. It's all I have." Cale regarded her with contempt, but after a call to Thorn, he returned and threw a cheap sketchbook and a single charcoal pencil on her bed. "Don't get any ideas," he grunted. It was the only weapon she had. She didn't draw landscapes or portraits. She drew the room. She drew the guards. She sat for hours, seemingly lost in her art, but her eyes were recording everything. She sketched Kyle's meticulous posture, the way he cleaned his weapon with obsessive precision. She drew Benning, the quiet one, a study in self-effacement, how he moved along the walls, his presence so minimal he was practically negative space. And she drew Reyes. She drew his nervous energy, the constant tap of his foot, the way he tore through his energy drinks, the cans. It always came back to the cans. In part 1, she'd noted his obsession with the brand. Now she watched his ritual. He would drink one, crush it in his fist, and leave it on the kitchen counter. It wasn't just carelessness, it was a signal. He never threw them directly in the trash. He left them. For who? An hour later, Benning, the invisible man, would do a quiet sweep of the common areas, collecting stray dishes and trash. He would pick up the can and dispose of it, every single time. It was a dead drop. It had to be. A method of communication, so mundane it was invisible. Reyes was the source, Benning was the courier. Croft didn't have one mole. He had two, a loud one to draw the eye and a quiet one to do the real work. It was the same pattern as the restaurant, the loud attacker and the quiet spotter. Thorn, for all his tactical brilliance, was looking for a single point of failure. He wasn't looking for a system, but a theory wasn't proof. Accusing 2 of his men would get her sedated and locked in a padded room. She needed to catch them, to find the message itself. Her chance came when Reyes left a can on the counter and went to the gym. Harper walked out of her room, feigning a trip to the kitchen for water. Benning was in the living room, his back to her, watching the street below. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She tripped, stumbling against the counter, sending the can clattering to the floor along with a glass of water she'd been carrying. "Sorry, so clumsy," she mumbled, dropping to her knees to clean up the mess. Benning glanced over, his face impassive, before turning back to the window. Under the guise of wiping up water, Harper's fingers frantically searched the crushed aluminum. There. At the bottom, where the can creased inward, was a tiny, perfect slit, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. It was just wide enough for a micro SD card. She had the method. Now she needed to connect the courier to the mastermind. She thought back to the restaurant, to the detail she'd given Thorn. A ring? Gold? A bird on it? An eagle, maybe. Benning wore no such ring. He wore a simple, plain wedding band. It was a dead end. No, she told herself. An artist doesn't see dead ends. They see negative space. He wasn't wearing it now. She needed to get close. She needed to see his hands. Later that day, She approached him while he was reviewing security logs on a tablet. "Benning," she said, her voice soft. "My back. The stitches are pulling. Could you just look? I can't see them." It was a plea for help, a damsel in distress act she despised, but it was necessary. He hesitated, annoyed at the distraction, but complied. He stood and walked over, his professional duty overriding his suspicion. "Turn around," he said gruffly. As he leaned in to inspect her bandages, she kept her eyes on his hands. He wore his wedding band, but just as she'd hoped, there was a distinct pale line on his finger, the ghost of a much larger, wider ring he no longer wore. And then she saw it. On the inside of his right wrist, partially obscured by the strap of his watch, was a tattoo. It was small, no bigger than a dime, but its lines were sharp and clear. A single stylized eagle's wing, the symbol of Croft's old unit, the connection. She now had the method and the man, but it was still her word against a trusted soldier. She needed the final piece. She needed to bait the trap and force them to act. She needed to use Thorne's most prized possession against his own men, the ledger. For the next 24 hours, she filled her sketchbook not with drawings of guards, but with complex geometric patterns, strings of alphanumeric code, and flowcharts that mimicked cryptographic analysis. She made it look like she was trying to break a code. She worked feverishly, muttering to herself, leaving pages open on her desk where they could be seen. She was creating the illusion that the bored, artistic Waitress had a hidden talent for cryptology, and that she was on the verge of cracking the ledger she knew Thorne kept in the apartment's main safe. The final touch was a performance. She waited until she knew Reyes was walking past her open door. She held up a page of her nonsensical scribbles, her eyes wide with a staged eureka moment. "The primary key isn't a number. It's a sequence, a cadence," she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. She then quickly hid the sketchbook under her mattress. She saw the flicker of alarm in his eyes before he moved on. The bait was taken. He would believe she had the key, or was close to it. Information that valuable couldn't wait for the next scheduled dead drop. He would have to report it to Croft immediately. He would have to use the can tonight. She had assembled her proof. Now she had to stage the reveal. She couldn't afford a private conversation with Thorne. It had to be public, undeniable, in front of everyone. So there could be no quiet cover-up, no disposal of a compromised asset. She waited for the evening shift change, the one time all four men, Thorne, Kyle, Reyes, and Benning, were guaranteed to be in the main living area for a briefing. Reyes, jumpy with his new information, had just finished an energy drink and placed the crushed can in its usual spot on the counter. Benning was beginning his quiet tidying routine. Kyle stood by Thorne's side, a loyal shadow. Harper walked out of her room. The atmosphere instantly tensed. "Commander," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the low murmur of their conversation. All eyes snapped to her. Thorne's face was a mask of cold fury. He thought this was a final, desperate plea. "You're wrong about me," she said, her gaze locked on his. "And you're blind to the threat right here in this room. You're looking for a single traitor, but you should be looking for a system." Reyes scoffed. Kyle took a half-step forward, ready to restrain her. "It's not about the burner phones," Harper continued, her voice gaining strength. "That was a plant, a distraction to make you focus on me. Their real communication is slower, safer, so mundane you'd never even see it." She walked calmly to the kitchen counter and picked up the crushed energy drink can. She held it up. "This is how they talk." The room was silent. She could see the pity and annoyance in Cale's eyes. This was the rambling of a desperate, unstable woman. "Reyes, you leave one of these every time you have something to report," she said, looking directly at him. His face was a mask of confusion, but a tic started in his jaw. "You're the source." She then turned the can over, her thumbnail finding the nearly invisible slit. "You leave a message inside." She then turned her gaze on the other man. "And Benning, you're the courier, the quiet man, the one who takes out the trash, the ghost, just like your partner at the restaurant." Benning's face remained passive, but his stillness was suddenly predatory. "I told you the spotter wore a ring," she said to Thorne. "An eagle. Benning doesn't wear it on the job, but he can't hide the tattoo of its wing on his wrist." Thorne and Cale both instinctively glanced at Benning's wrist. It was a flicker, but it was enough. The seed of doubt was planted. "That's insane," Reyes stammered, finding his voice. "She's making it all up." "Am I?" Harper said, turning back to Thorne. "The bait that made you believe I was a traitor was a burner phone. The bait I used to catch them was you." She held up her sketchbook. "For the past day, I've pretended to be a cryptology genius. I let Reyes see me cracking your ledger. He thinks these pages contain the key." She tossed the sketchbook onto the coffee table. That information was too vital to wait. He had to send it to Croft tonight. So he put a micro SD card in this can. Right now, it's in here. It will have a message for Croft, telling him I have the key, that I'm the new priority target, and that they need to extract me or eliminate me immediately. She placed the can on the table in front of Thorne. The challenge hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It was a moment of perfect clarity. Either she was completely insane, or she had just exposed his entire operation to a catastrophic failure. Thorne stared at the can, then at Harper. The cold certainty in his eyes wavered, replaced by the analytical gaze she'd seen in the restaurant. He was a man who dealt in facts, and she had just presented him with a testable hypothesis. He gave a sharp, almost imperceptible nod to Kyle. In a fluid motion, Kyle drew his sidearm and leveled it at Reyes. "Don't move," he growled. Benning froze, his hand inching toward his own weapon, but another of Thorne's men emerged from the hallway, gun trained on him. The trap was sprung. Thorne picked up the can. He pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his pocket and inserted the tip into the slit Harper had shown him. With a slight twist, he pried it open. A tiny black square, no bigger than a fingernail, fell out and skittered across the polished surface of the table. A micro SD card. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world breaking. Reyes's face crumpled in pure terror. Benning's composure finally cracked, his eyes darting toward the exits. Kyle stared at the tiny piece of plastic, his face pale with the sickening realization of how thoroughly they had been played, and how close he had come to helping them execute an innocent woman. But Harper only watched Thorne. She saw the storm in his eyes return, but this time it wasn't directed at her. It was a hurricane of fury, self-recrimination, and a cold, lethal focus. He had been blind. He had trusted the uniform, the training, the system, and a waitress with an artist's eye had seen the truth he had missed. He slowly lifted his gaze from the card to her face. The calculation was gone. The suspicion was gone. All that remained was that flicker she had seen in the first moments on the restaurant floor. Respect. Hard-earned and absolute. 1 year later, the office was a study in minimalist design, glass walls, brushed steel, and screens displaying flowing lines of data. Harper stood before a massive interactive monitor, her fingers tracing connections on a complex network map. She wore a simple, elegant grey dress, a stark contrast to the black and white waitress uniform, that felt like a relic from another lifetime. The scars on her back were faint silver lines, a permanent reminder of the night her world shattered and was rebuilt anew. The firm was called Negative Space Analytics, Thorne's creation. After dismantling Julian Croft's network, a swift, brutal, and entirely off-the-books operation that ended with Croft becoming, as Thorne clinically put it, no longer a factor, he had redirected his considerable resources. He had built a private intelligence consultancy that didn't rely on signals intelligence or brute force. It relied on seeing the things everyone else missed. Harper was his lead analyst. Her artist's eye, once a useless trait that only helped her notice the sadness in a rich man's wife, was now her greatest weapon. She saw the patterns in human behavior, the tells in financial data, the subtle cracks in the facades of corporations and governments. She wasn't a liability to be protected. She was the core of the entire operation. The door slid open and Thorne entered. He no longer wore the constant armor of a man at war. He moved with the same economy of motion, but the tension in his shoulders was gone. He looked at the map, then at her. There was an easy respect between them now, a partnership forged in betrayal and blood. Reyes and Benning gave their final depositions last week, he said, his voice calm. They'll be spending the rest of their lives in a very quiet, very deep hole. Justice, in Thorne's world, was as efficient as it was permanent. Good, she said, not taking her eyes off the screen. They were just soldiers. Croft was the disease. Thorne stood beside her, looking at the web of connections she had mapped out. It was a new case, a suspected leak within a global shipping conglomerate. To him, it was a mess of raw data. To her, it was a composition. "What do you see?" he asked. It was the question he always asked, the one that affirmed her value, her purpose. Harper pointed to a small, seemingly insignificant node on the periphery of the network, a series of charitable donations made by a low-level executive. Everyone's looking at the big cargo shipments, the encrypted manifests. They're looking for a cannonball. Her finger traced a faint line from the donations to a shell corporation halfway across the world. But the betrayal isn't a cannonball. It's a whisper. It's a crack in the foundation that no one thought to check. She turned from the screen to face him, a quiet confidence in her eyes that had been bought at a terrible price. She was no longer the invisible waitress, nor the caged witness. She had found her own power, not by adopting his, but by embracing hers. "It's always in the details," she said, a faint smile touching her lips. "I always see the cracks."